Mind, whatever you like.
Mm,
Oh, I thought actually me and Dylan maybe mentioned that we would continue talking about what we were talking about in the chat earlier.
Yeah, meta ethics.
okay, that's cool. Um, Dylan, are you recording?
Yeah.
I'm gonna start recording mine too.
Okay, and I'm also recording the video as well.
Cool.
So did you want to set things up, Dylan?
Yeah, for the podcast introduction.
Yeah, however you want to play.
Yeah. Okay. Welcome to Arguments from Reason. This is another episode, and we have a guest we had on before, Alex Malpass. It's good to have him on, and we're going to be talking about meta ethics today, certain theories of ethics, and hopefully we will have a good discussion. So, James, do you want to say anything to start?
I just want to say hi, and I'm really excited for this dialogue. It's always a joy to speak with Alex Malpass, and we're always honored whenever he comes on our podcast. And this would be the second time, and hopefully, uh, more to come.
Thanks very much. It's nice to speak to you guys too.
Okay, so to get started here, let's just talk a bit about what meta ethics is generically. What is the project of meta ethics?
Yeah. Okay. So we need to distinguish between two types of questions that we might have, right? So we might say ask a question about like. So we might say it in the same question, but mean it in two ways, right? We might say what is right, okay, and what is good or what is wrong or whatever, right? Instead, this type of like moral question, and taken one way, the question's asking for an example of a thing that's right or wrong, right? So someone says to you, look, what is good, right? And you could say something like, well, giving to charity is good, okay, and then we could have a discussion between the two of us about, well, no. List all the things we think are good, and when we find a disagreement, we might wonder between us, or like which one of us is right, or something along those lines. Right? We're just sorting out which of the things that there are good and which of the things are bad. And we might call that practical ethics, I suppose, because what we're doing is like talking about actual things and trying to decide between ourselves which of those is good and which of those is bad. Like what should we do, right? Like, what shouldn't we do? But then we might.
We call that applied ethics?
Yeah, possibly. I guess so, yeah. So real life situations, we're trying to, like, in this recent case with the Charlie Gard, that baby, where it was all about, like, should the life support be turned off and should they have this extra treatment and stuff. Like, the idea there is this particular action, this token action, is that good or bad, right? Like, so the question of practical ethics is a real world question, right? It's like which of these actual real life examples is good and which of them is bad. Meta ethics, as the name suggests, is a bit more kind of taking a step back from that. So when we look at our question again, what is good, right? Now we're answering that question not as a kind of like, give me an example of something that's good, but we're asking like, what does it mean for something to be good? Like what is goodness? Like what's going on with that? So rather than giving examples of something, what we're trying to do now is give a kind of theoretical background to the term. So examples of different meta-ethical theories would be examples of ways of generating lists of things that are good and bad, right? So we're not so much concerned now with like which individual things are good or bad, but like what's the way of determining which things are good or bad, something like that, right?
So could we say that it's basically thinking about the criteria for determining good and bad, like coming up with some scheme of criteria that would need to be met to determine whether some action is good or bad?
Yeah, something like that, right? So an example of a meta-ethical theory is, say, for instance, deontology. Right? So according to deontology, one way of looking at it anyway would be you'd say something like, what's good or bad is what's in conformity with moral prescription, or so, right? Sorry, what's good is what's in conformity with the moral prescription. What you ought to do is act in accordance with the moral prescription. And so you might say there's like a rule which says something like you shouldn't kill, and breaking that rule means that what you're doing is bad, right? Killing is something that you ought not do on the basis that there's this rule which says that you ought not do it. On the other hand, a different meta-ethical theory is utilitarianism, which says something like what's good is the maximization of pleasure or well-being or something, and what's bad is like unnecessary pain or the diminishment of well-being. Right? So it might be that in these cases they overlap. So it might be that in most cases killing is a diminishment of well-being and a promotion of pain or something, and so it's bad. And also there's this, most people would say there's a kind of moral obligation to not kill. And so the two cases agree there. On the other hand, you might get a case where these two meta-ethical theories calculate a different result. So a classic example is like lying or keeping a promise rather. So you might say that just as it's a moral prescription to not kill, it's also a moral duty to not lie as well, right? So you should always tell the truth. So you should always say what you think is true, right? So, and then the case would be something like the case where they tell between two of them. And so like the utilitarian would say something like, well, you should always say, you should only do, what maximizes pleasure and minimizes harm. So, and lying sometimes does that, but telling the truth sometimes does that, but lying sometimes does that too, right? So you shouldn't always tell the truth. Sometimes you should lie. Whereas a deontologist would just say, look, it's a rule that you shouldn't lie, so you shouldn't lie. So the classic case is that say some, it's World War II or whatever, and some Jewish family running away from the Gestapo knocks at your door and asks you to hide them in the basement. So you say yes. And a few minutes later, there's a knock at the door, and the Gestapo guard says, "Are you hiding Jews in your basement?" Now, if you're going to, well, let's say that you've promised the Jewish family that you won't rat them out if the Gestapo come, right? And then the Gestapo captain directly asks you, "Are you hiding Jews in your basement?" So you either keep your promise to the Jewish family, or you lie to the Gestapo chief. Now, I suppose it's an awkward dilemma for the deontologist. But let's say we weren't worrying about whether or not we should lie to the Gestapo chief. Well, if the deontologist says there's an absolute prescription on lying, so you should never lie, it seems like what the right thing to do there is to not lie, which means to in effect do something which gives the lives of the Jewish family away to the Gestapos, where they're going to be killed, let's say. The utilitarian, on the other hand, is going to say, look, lying is, to some extent it does, it's not like a practice that promotes harm in the long run, but on this occasion, certainly it's much more likely that there's going to be an increase in harm if you tell the truth. So what you should do is lie in this case, right? So we can see that the answer to the practical ethical question, like which action is right and which action is wrong, do get different results given the choice of meta-ethical theory that we pick in the first place. But so we kind of picking a theoretical framework which then spits out answers to ethical questions for us. Does that help as a way of framing what metaethics is?
Yeah, I think that helps. So the idea is just that it is a field of moral ethics which seeks to method of determining what is good and what is bad, and that can then be applied to determining the answers to practical moral questions.
Yeah, so I mean, that's right. I guess just to nuance it a little bit, I don't suppose that it has to be a kind of method for giving you knowledge about what's good or bad. So it might be that on a utilitarian view, you never really know all of the consequences of your actions, right? So for all I know, if I was to say yes to the Gestapo guy, then I don't know, there'd be some unexpected consequence, right? That like the Jewish family would end up escaping in such a way that it brought the war to an end. you know, that they get brought into the Gestapo police station, but before they're all shot, they manage to escape and kill Hitler at the same time, and that brings the war to a quick end, and it actually reduces harm overall if I was to hand them over. Right? I don't know that that's not going to happen. I can't actually foresee exactly everything that's going to happen. So utilitarianism as a way of, it's more like it's a theory about what is good and what is bad, right? Even if it doesn't give me like a kind of an infallible method for coming to knowledge about what's good or bad. It's just that's what good and bad is according to utilitarianism, which is the reduction of harm. Whereas on deontology, it's a slightly different view, and it says what's good is like what's in accordance with the moral rules, and what's bad is what's not in accordance with the moral rules or something. So they, it's not just so much as a technique for coming to knowledge about it. It's just it's a view about what good is and what bad is, right?
You're right. So it describes what is good and what is bad. Different theories describing these things, and although it could be used to answer practical questions, it does not guarantee any sort of knowledge of these practical questions or the answers to them. So how then philosophers think about coming up with a theory in metaethics? What strategies can they use to come up with some type of theory and determine between utilitarianism and deontology or any other metaethical theory?
Well, like with so if we're talking about philosophical theories, then it seems to me that there's very general considerations that are in play regardless of whether the topic is ethics or metaphysics or anything else like that, right? Theories should be consistent as a bare minimum. It seems like that's a reasonably good constraint. It's not inviolable perhaps, but it seems like a pretty good starting point. So if we can show an outright contradiction in a theory, that seems to count very strongly against the theory being correct. So that's a theoretical virtue that we want to take into consideration. They should be, where possible, there should be some kind of explanatory value to them. Right? You should explain as much of the phenomenon as possible. There should be some like plausible, as possible, and that's not necessarily deciding case, but some like a good ethical theory, just like a good theory in philosophy generally, shouldn't be unnecessarily postulating unknowable entities, right? It's kind of Occam's razor. So if we end up with a theory where it means that we can't actually know anything about morality, where it seems intuitively that we do, that would count against the theory. So yeah, I mean, it's difficult to pin down to an algorithm what makes ethicists pick between their theories. I'm not sure that there's a good, clear answer here, but all the same sorts of considerations that it seems to me are in play when we're choosing between any types of theory, even scientific theories, right? If your theory can make predictions, then wonderful, right? That really does help in favor. It seems unlikely in a meta-ethics that your theory is going to make predictions, but theoretical virtues are good regardless of what the theory is, it seems to me. So broadly speaking, we can cut meta-ethics into two different ways. We can look at realist theories and anti-realist theories. So what the realism, anti-realism divide is something like, if you take a statement like, I don't know, giving to charity is good. For a realist, they want to say something like that statement could be true. It's a sort of statement that could be true, and if it was true, then it would be made true by something that exists, something that's part of the world, right? So something that makes it true. It's something like that anyway, right? So a realist it thinks that there's something like a property of goodness, and that property is a real feature of the world. So when you're talking about something having the property of goodness, it's not like I don't know, something that's like man-made, part of my mind or something. It's really out there in the world. So, and an anti-realist will say something like, no, when we say things are good or bad, we don't mean that they're properties like that they're heavy or square or something. What we mean is that it's like an attitude that we have or something. It's a convention that we agree upon, whatever. It's not really one of the things that exists in the world. something like that. Or they might say that moral statements are the sorts of things that can be true or false. It just happens that they're all false, right? It could be like an error theorist. Or yet again, another permutation of anti-realism is you could say the moral statements are not the sorts of things that could be true or false, right? They're like other types of speech act. So if I say something like "shut the door," right, that sentence isn't true or false, right? It's like a command or a request or something, right? So it's successful perhaps if you shut the door, but it's not true if you shut the door. Me saying "can you shut the door, please," doesn't become true if you shut the door, right? That's just mixing terms up, right? So there are bits of language that are not truth apt. They just have other functions like requests or jokes or suggestive comments or something, right? Not everything is a declaration of the way things are. And so someone who takes this view about ethics might say something like, look, when you say something is good, it's really just equivalent to sort of like jumping up and down with excitement about that thing. Or when you say something is bad, it's really just equivalent to you saying like boo, right? Boo murder or something, right? And yay charity, boo murder, right? So they're not, that's saying boo murder isn't true, it's not false, it just expresses something about the way I feel about it. So that type of position is called non-cognitivism. So there's this kind of like dividing line between those types of considerations. You might have to kind of think about which of those theories you want to look at more, which ones you find it plausible or not. I mean, some people, it seems to me, have strong intuition that ethical statements are not really describing the way that the world is. There's a lot of people out there.
So I guess that for a lot of people, it seems intuitively true that there are real moral facts about the world and that certain things really are wrong, and it's not just this kind of emotional disposition towards certain statements. Like for most people, it is a real meaningful true statement, and it's not just something like they prefer that people aren't killed or something like that.
Yeah,
it's just based in an intuition about the world, and it's not something that can really be demonstrably proven or to give an argument for. All you can really do is try to draw out that intuition in other people, it seems to me. Would that be right?
It's certainly true that people do have that feeling, right? So people do very strongly say things like, well, so one way of doing it is that if someone is trying to say that they think that moral judgments are subjective things, right, just opinions. So what we might be saying here is a bit like maybe artistic appreciation, right? So if we're both looking at the same painting and I say that painting is beautiful and you say no, that painting is not beautiful, what might be going on here, you might think, is that I'm really just saying I like that painting and you're just saying I don't like that painting, right? So, you know, Alex saying that he likes it and Dylan saying that Dylan doesn't like it isn't a case where two people are uttering the same, well, you know, one's uttering a proposition and the other one is uttering the negation of that proposition. It's not really a disagreement, right? Me liking it and you not liking it are quite compatible with each other. And that might be what's going on. So we could agree that, you know, there's this bit is blue and that bit over there is red, and that's a square shape in the painting. We agree on all the, you know, physical features of the painting. And when it comes to, you know, and then I just say, well, I like those physical features, and you say, well, I don't like those physical features. We're not disagreeing at that point. We'd only be disagreeing if we said there was another property about the painting, which was its beauty, and I say that it's got beauty and you say that it doesn't, right? But so on one kind of subjectivist look at aesthetics, you might say that beauty isn't another objective property, like there being a bit of blue over here or whatever. It's all in the head, right? It's all in the eye of the beholder. And so the moral subjectivist is saying something similar to that here, right? So he's saying if one person says a murder is bad and the other person says no, murder is not bad, really there's not a case of disagreement. It's just that one person's saying I disapprove of murder and the other person's saying I don't disapprove of murder, right? So Alex disapproving of murder and Dylan not disapproving of murder, it's not a case of disagreement, right? It's just that, you know, I'm stating my opinion, you're stating yours, and you know, so if it mirrors the case of aesthetic subjectivism, then there can't really be moral disagreement. All there can be is different opinions about whether we like or dislike various sort of moral situations. And then so you can sort of bring about that if that someone is espousing that that's their view, the common kind of like a rhetorical strategy would be to kind of like bring their attention to cases where there seems to be like, you know, universal agreement or something. Like isn't it the case that in the Holocaust or something that, you know, this is bad, right? It's not, it doesn't, are you just saying that, you know, because Hitler didn't think it was bad, then, you know, it kind of wasn't bad for him? Because, you know, if it was all good and bad means it's just like people's opinions, then like, because he didn't think it was bad, it kind of wasn't bad. And then you're led into this like sort of uncomfortable situation of like having to moderate what otherwise would be a kind of unrestrained condemnation of the Holocaust, and into having to sort of like uncomfortably make room for the idea that in actual fact, you know, it isn't really that bad for Hitler because he didn't really mind or something. And that, it's not a very good strategy unless the person finds that to be unintuitive, right? It's kind of easy in some cases to be a subjectivist, and the difficult cases for them are these ones where there seems to be kind of a good intuitive pull towards like something being not just subjectively bad, but like objectively bad. So yeah.
Like when I hear Christian apologists using a moral argument for God's existence, and one of the premises is that there are objective moral values, and then people deny it, what they'll do is they'll use that same rhetorical strategy to try to convince them that, or at least that to convince them that they already believe that there really are. They're just like denying it, I guess. So then they'll bring up examples of the Holocaust or something. Is there any other strategies a moral realist could use to try to convince the activists that there really are objective moral truths of the world?
Yeah, there probably is a good argument for moral realism that I can't think of off the top of my head. I'm reminded of Avicenna's argument that that there can't be any contradictions, which is something like if somebody says that there can be contradictions, was it they should be burnt alive and until they admit that the flames hurt them and don't also not hurt them, something like that, right? If somebody thinks that there's no such thing as, or if somebody thinks that moral judgments are all in the head, they kind of need to reflect upon the idea of like, well, what would it be like for you if everyone thought that it was good to just kind of mercilessly pick on you every day of your entire life, right? Like, you would you be willing to accept that all that was bad about that was your own opinion, that it was wrong, or like would you be willing to live with the consequences of that? I don't know if there's there's probably a really strong argument I can't think of off the top of my head, but it seems to me like I wouldn't have much more to motivate the view than that really, than appealing to the fact that most people already really don't want to go all the way down the line of saying moral subjectivism is true. Well, I suppose like there's also arguments in if you want to say something. Look, so sometimes people use the idea of like moral progress to be an argument in favor of subjectivism, because they'll say things like, look, ethics changes in situation to situation, right? Like in, I don't know, Roman times or something, people would do certain practice X, and now in practice in some other culture, Babylonians or something would do practice Y, and you know, it just was good to do X in the Roman times and good to do Y in the Babylonian times, because you know it's just like all a matter of context, and you know, it's kind of relativism or subjectivism that follows from that kind of view. On the other hand, there's the idea of moral progress, is that we're sort of going in the right direction, right? So like we think of the, you know, abolition of slavery and emancipation of women, and like these ideas are not just changes in society, like indifferent changes in what we think of as being good or bad, right? They are changes for the better, right? We want to say something like those people in the past were wrong about thinking that slavery was good, right? Even if their culture and everyone they knew thought that it was good, right? It wasn't. it was bad. And when we abolished slavery, that was a step in the right direction. So if you think that that's true, then it's very difficult to reconcile that with a completely subjectivist view, right? So the idea of moral progress, it seems to me, is unintelligible if on a not anti-realist view of ethics. It just becomes equivalent to changing your moral view rather than improving it.
Yeah, so like I can think of an example of, say, like Martin Luther King Jr. and the end of segregation in America. And so if something like subjectivism were true, then there'd be no real motive for people to change the state of affairs as it was then, because most people at that time, or at least a majority of people, didn't. And then there were political movements to change that. So if morality is merely subjective, then there's not really a metric where we can say, well, this was an actual case of moral improvement. Mm-hmm. That's a good strategy. Although I guess the subjectivist could just say, well, they could just bite the bullet and say, well, it's only a moral improvement because I prefer the way it is now.
Yeah.
Effectively, in any sense, a moral improvement.
Exactly. Completely. So what we're talking about here is strategies for like appealing to things that other people already agree with. So it's a kind of consistency test. Someone advances a subjectivist view. Are they happy with the consequence that they can't that you kind of have to have a modified condemnation of the Nazis, and it's wrong for me, but it wasn't necessarily wrong in any other sense? Are they happy with abandoning the idea that moral progress is a real thing? It's only progress in my eyes, but outside of my view, there's no such thing. Blah blah blah. If they're happy with all those consequences, then fine. But the point is, if someone wants to advance that view, but also wants to hold that there's some intelligible idea of moral progress, then they owe us a story. They need to say something about how that makes sense on their own view. It seems like it's going to be a tall story, right? A difficult thing for them to be able to come up with. So there's no knockdown. I don't suppose there's going to be a completely knockdown argument there, but if we look at realist, anti-realist, if we look at the realist view, then we can cut realists into two categories as well. So one type of realist would be a naturalist, and another type would be non-naturalist, right? So it's an exclusive category between different types of realists. So this exactly what the dividing line is between naturalism and non-naturalism is going to be kind of contentious as well. But one way of thinking about it, as the name suggests, of course, would be that a natural goodness is a natural property, right? So among those properties, like, I don't know, the property of being square, or like gravity, or like space, or like material objects, or something like that, among all of those kind of like things which you think of as like paradigmatically natural, the sorts of things that science can investigate, that our perceptions interact with, blah blah blah, these things we can measure and build theories about and test. Among those things are moral properties. So might say in a reductivist account, something like this: look, moral properties are real properties because the property of goodness is the property of the promotion of pleasure, or something. So good just is the promotion of pleasure. So there's no extra property over and above the promotion of pleasure, which we call goodness. It's just that the promotion of pleasure is goodness, right? So on that view, goodness is a natural property because pleasure is a natural property. It's something that goes on in the brain. It's kind of chemical reaction that we have, that goes on in the physical world. So on the other hand, a moral non-naturalist wants to say something like the property of being good isn't one of those physical properties, right? Something over and above the collection of physical properties. So you could describe, I don't know, the positions of everything in the world, all the locations and velocities and stuff like that. You describe it completely physically, and then you wouldn't have picked out the moral properties yet. The moral properties is something over and above all of those natural properties. So they're not the sort of things that we can investigate with science, and not the sort of things that can be directly measured and tested in exactly the same type of way, right? Non-empirical kind of entities. Okay, so of those two views, of course, at first glance, the naturalist view seems to be better, right? It's good, kind of ontologically cheaper for one thing. So you don't want to postulate that there are things which exist in some way that are completely unverifiable if you don't have to. Kind of theoretical parsimony, you'd want a nicer, sort of cheaper theory if it can do all the same work, right? So the first glance would be to prefer a type of naturalism. Now, one way of responding to naturalism on behalf of the non-naturalists here is, and it seems to me that this move is kind of telling. So let's say, okay, so let's say we're trying this move where we identify goodness with the property of promoting pleasure. Now, so there's the question of like the statement that goodness is the promotion of pleasure. Now, that statement can take one of two types, right? It could be a kind of definition, right? Which is that a bit like the way that you might say a bachelor is an unmarried man, right? So if goodness is the promotion of pleasure, is a definition in that sense, then questioning whether goodness is the promotion of pleasure should be like questioning whether a bachelor is an unmarried man, right? But there's something weird about questioning whether a bachelor is an unmarried man, because it seems to us like someone who makes that type of question is someone who's just not in possession of the concept of bachelor, because it just means unmarried man, right? So someone who asks that question just doesn't know what bachelor or unmarried man means. Right? That's the type of mistake they're making.
It sounds like they'd be asking for definition or definitional clarification or something if they're asking that type of question.
Right, exactly. So, or another way of saying that is that because it's a definition, their question displays that they lack an understanding of what the meanings of the two terms are. Right? So it's saying the same thing, it's a slightly different way. On the other hand, if someone asks, well, you know, is goodness the promotion of pleasure? It doesn't sound like it's a, doesn't sound the same. It doesn't sound as trivial. Right? Doesn't seem like someone is simply lacking concept of goodness. It seems like they're asking a substantive question. Right? Like, it sounds more like the other type of way that that statement could be read, right? So that if it's not an analytic statement like that, we might think the other option would have to be that it's a synthetic statement. So it's not a matter of definition, not true by definition, then it's true because something in the world makes it the way that it is, right? So if I say something like Alex, James, and Dylan are the only three people in this hangout, the phrase "the only three people in this hangout" isn't defined as being Alex, James, and Dylan, right? Because someone else could join this hangout. So it's not like the meaning of the people in this hangout is us three. It just happens to be the case that the two things coincide right now, right? So that statement is true, but it's made true not by the meanings of the words, but by the way the things in the world happen to line up, right? So that's an example of a synthetic statement. Now, if you want to say, if we find it like difficult, you know, that argument I was just making a minute ago that goodness is a promotion of pleasure just doesn't seem like it's a definitional truth, right? It seems like it's not analytic, but it seems synthetic. Now, then what we're saying is that there's this concept of good, and it's not that it means the same thing as the promotion of pleasure. It's just that we're saying that two things happen to coincide right now. Right? That's an empirical claim about the way that the world happens to be. Then it seems to me that the problem is we're left wondering what it is that coincides with the promotion of pleasure, right? What is the other side of that statement that we just read? You said good is the promotion of pleasure. And if it's a synthetic claim, then we're saying there's two things that happen to coincide right now. Well, what is the good that's supposed to coincide with the promotion of pleasure? Well, we're not able to fill that in any way, right? What we were trying to do is to fill that in the first place by saying that it is the promotion of pleasure. But the only two ways we saw of doing that was as an analytic statement or as a synthetic statement. It doesn't sound like an analytic statement, but if it's a synthetic statement, then it kind of leaves open the very question we were trying to ask in the first place. So it seems to me, anyway, at the moment, although I changed my mind about this quite a lot, it seems to me at the moment that that's pretty decisive, pretty good reason to think that the naturalist project in general doesn't make any sense. Right? Moral naturalism seems incoherent. And that leads me to the view that a version of non-naturalism should be preferred, right? Because I want to say something like, look, if, so you could say, identify all these conditions that lead to harm or pain or something, right? Like if you stab someone in the eye with a knife, then what happens is all these nerve endings start firing and their brain emits this hormone and blah, blah, blah. These conditions, physical things happen, right? And that's painful. Okay, great. And so you could say, look, that's why I say that you shouldn't stab someone in the eye, right? Because like doing so is painful. But while you may have identified that doing something like that is painful, you haven't yet shown that you shouldn't do it, right? What you need to show in order to show that is that in addition to those physical descriptions that you just identified being true, you also have to show that pain is bad, right? In order for it to follow that you shouldn't do that, right? It needs to be something that's bad. And well, I think we just saw that it's going to be very difficult to, well, it seems to me that it's going to be impossible to derive the fact that pain is bad merely by looking at the physical description of what's going on in the world, unless you have as a basic fact that doing that type of thing which causes pain is bad because pain is bad. You have to at some point insert manually this fact, which is a moral fact, right? Which is just that pain has this property of being bad. Something along those lines, right? Unless you bring it in explicitly, it's not going to fall out of a mere description of the physical things that are going on in the world. So it seems to me that however you cut this pie, you're going to need to insert a non-natural moral property of goodness or badness somewhere.
So part of the problem here for the naturalist is that when you just observe the world and you observe some instance of pain, they can only describe the things that lead up to pain, like the bodily functions or whatever that's causing the pain.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't derive from that it is bad. So it seems what they try to do is just define it as bad. And instead of saying this is bad by virtue of it having some property of being bad or whatever, they just rather say this is definitionally bad. This is in its own nature. This is what badness is, rather than possessing the property of badness. So that seems to be trying to avoid the implication that you're speaking of, that you can't derive an ought from an is. Like this is pain, but this you can't derive from that not ought to be, right? So is that a fair assessment to say that they're basically just defining it as bad, and that's kind of almost a tautology at that point?
Well, I think the problem with that is that it isn't a tautology. It would be good if it was, in fact, a tautology, right? They're trying to say that it's a tautology. But if it was a tautology, then asking whether or not pain was bad would be like asking if pain was pain, right?
Right. It wouldn't be a sensible question.
Yeah, or it would be kind of a trivial question or something. It would be like, well, it has to be the case. Or if someone says, is a bachelor an unmarried man? What we're doing there is, it's what's weird about that is that it's true by definition. Right? So the question, obviously, it kind of doesn't make sense to ask the question. Yeah, it does make sense to ask the question whether pain is bad, right? It might be true that pain is bad, right? But it's not simply on account of the meaning of the words, right? It's intelligible to wonder whether pain is bad. And the intelligibility of the question itself should undermines the claim that it's actually a matter of definition. So I think that the move that naturalists want to make, which is that it's true by definition, is implausible. It just doesn't seem to be the case that it's true by definition. It looks like a synthetic claim. But if it's a synthetic claim, then it's not a natural property.
Right. So, because if it was true by definition, then the question of whether or not pain is bad would not even be a question to be asked unless someone was just ignorant of what pain or what badness is. But isn't this something similar that a divine command theorist would do in terms of God is the standard or definition of good? So when they say God is good, they're not saying, well, God possesses these good-making properties, that if someone possesses them, they're good. They're just saying what God is, that's what good is.
Yeah, so I think that the argument I just gave then against naturalism cuts equally well against the divine command theorists, like you're saying here. So let's say a divine command theorist wants to say something like, look, what's good is what God commands. Okay. Now we can say something like, is that statement there, that what's good is what God commands, is that a matter of definition, or is it a substantive truth about the way that things happen to be? So is it like saying bachelors are unmarried men, or is it like saying Alex, James, and Dylan are the only three people in this hangout? Right? Which of those two types of statement is it? Now, if you want to take the first route and say that it's a matter of definition, that what's good is what God commands, then we run into exactly the same problem as before, because it seems like asking the question, is what good God commands good, is intelligible, right? And it seems like it is intelligible because, for one thing, some of the things that God seems to command in the Bible seem like they need a lot of explanation and justification for them before they can even be seen as good, right? Like God testing Job or something. If it was just a matter of definition that everything that God does is good, there seemed to be, it seemed like you wouldn't be able to wonder why, like in what way is that good, right? It would just be a simple question, like if you had an example of a story where there was a bachelor who was an unmarried man, right? You wouldn't need anyone to explain it to you how that was the case. It would be a matter of definition. But in that case, it really doesn't seem like what God's doing is good until, someone has to explain it to you, or the testing of Abraham or whatever. There's all these examples, right? So it's easy, it's certainly intelligible that God commands bad things. So the question, does God in fact command good things? It's a very real, meaningful question. And that undermines the idea that it's simply a matter of definition, that whatever God commands is good. It just doesn't seem to be very plausible. So then the other option might be, well, look, maybe God commands all the good things, right? It just happens to be the case that everything God commands is good. Well, if that's right, then, that seems to me that that's a coherent way of looking at it, right? God sits there, knows all of the good things, and then when you ask him, God, what should I do? He only ever tells you to do good things. He just picks the good things for his commands to be, right? And that makes sense, that God's commands are good, but it's not good because it's a matter of definition. It's two things happen to coincide in the world. That would be rather like the first horn of the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Where God commands what's good because it's good, right? It's good independently of God's commanding it. It happens to be good. Even if God didn't command it, it would still be good. Even if God commanded something else, it would still be good to do this thing. And that's fine.
Right.
Most Christians won't accept that view, of course, because they want to say that God is kind of sovereign over everything, and there couldn't be these facts that were true about the world which were not there that way because God made them such, right? So most Christians want to defend the second horn of the Euthyphro dilemma, and it seems to me that gets cut away by this naturalism argument as well. So does that make
So if we say that if we take the one horn of the dilemma that God commands things because they're good, then it undermines his sovereignty, or that he's the source of all goodness, or anything that's true, or anything along those lines. But if we take the other horn and say, well, they're good because God commands them to be good, then, but if you can still question, well, why is God commanding Israel to slaughter the Canaanites or whatever, then it seems to be the case that, well, if it were the case that whatever God commands is good, then it's just obvious that, well, that's good because God commanded it. So I guess one thing that some divine command theorists would do is they would say either of these. It's that God is what goodness is, and therefore anything he commands is a duty given to us, but it's right or morally good just by virtue of it being consistent with God's character or nature.
Okay, right, good. So let's say someone's making this argument, right, and they're saying what's going on is that God's nature is good, right? So an action is good insofar as it's in conformity with God's nature. So let's say I do a charitable action, and that's good in virtue of the fact that God's nature has charity as one of its characteristics or something, right? So that's the reason that my good action is good. It's because it's in virtue of reflecting God's nature. It seems to be that's the Alston view that Craig endorses. It seems to me here that we haven't really done anything except change the parameters of the debate, but we have exactly the same considerations in play, right? So first of all, let's say, ask ourselves a question: is charity part of God's nature because charity is independently good, right? Is it just a synthetic fact that, is it just the way that the world happens to be, just the way that God happens to be, that his properties all line up with the good properties, right? It might be that case. So let's say James has nothing but good, virtuous properties. He's always nice to old people and gives money to charity, never steals when any money is presented to him, or he could do, blah, 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 right? James has his really good characteristics. Well, we're not going to say it's a matter of definition of James that he's good, right? We're just going to say James happens to always, have these good qualities. That just happens to be what James is like. So when I say James is good, I'm not saying it doesn't ground goodness in any way, right? Goodness is good independently of James. It just so happens that James's characteristics coincide with this quality of goodness. Now, we could look at God's properties in the same way, right? It might be like when we say God, why is charity part of God's nature? Well, charity is part of God's nature because charity is independently good, right? So it just happens to be that God coincides with God's characteristics, coincide with all the good characteristics, and he doesn't have any of the bad characteristics. Well, if we look at it that way around, then goodness is now independent of God again, right? It's exactly the same as the first horn of the dilemma that we were in the first place. But if we move around and say, well, okay, so it can't be that, right? It can't be that God's goodness is just kind of in virtue of the fact that his characteristics coincide with what's independently good. The only other view is to make it as kind of matter of definition again, right? So, well, the reason that or the reason that charity is good is simply that in virtue of the fact that it's possessed by God. It's one of God's characteristics. It's just a matter of definition that anything which is a characteristic that's possessed by God is good, just as a matter of definition. Well, it seems to me that the problem there then, again, aside from the fact that we could ask, but is charity good, right? Which seems like it's a meaningful question, and it shouldn't be if it's just simply a matter of definition, that anything which, knowing that is charity good even though it's possessed by God, you could ask as kind of like meaningful question, but it seems like it's on this view, it's being treated like it's a mere matter of definition. And the fact that it's an intelligible question undermines the claim that it's an intelligible question again, right? So we've got exactly the same considerations in play. Nothing's really changed by moving the discussion from God's actions to God's characteristics, right? Nothing of any substance has been altered. It's just a retreat to a different way of talking about exactly the same problem. But more than that, I think we can still press this even further, because there seems to be this kind of like disconnection problem here, right? Like if charity is good merely because it's possessed by God, then obviously we can run the same old kind of arbitrariness objection, which is to say something like, if being uncharitable was a property of God, then we would be forced into saying that uncharitability or miserliness or something was good instead of charity. And it just seems arbitrary what God's characteristics happen to be, it could have been anything, and we would have had to, by matter of definition, conclude that whatever those properties of God are good. And indeed, it doesn't seem, the God of the Bible is jealous and vengeful and all sorts of other properties, or at least the God of the Old Testament. And we don't always consider jealousy or whatever to be good properties. So it even seems not just to be intelligible that God's properties weren't good, but it seems to also be the case that they're not good if we're looking at the God of the Old Testament. So there seems to be that problem, but I think it also goes a step further than that, because if all that it is about the properties is their being possessed by God that makes them good, then we seem to have severed a kind of basic tie between the ascription of goodness to a property, right, to a characteristic, because there's nothing. So let's say charity is good, and charity is one of God's divine characteristics, right? Well, there's nothing about charity itself which makes it good. It's not an intrinsic property of charity that makes it good. It's an extrinsic property of charity. It's only good because it has a relation to God's nature. It's one of the members of God's nature. But that's not a charity. It's not a property about charity on its own. It's not just an intrinsic property to charity. It's an extrinsic property, and that, seems to me, sucks it sucks all of the meaning out of. So the arbitrariness worry is related to this, right? Because it's saying, well, any fact could stand in that extrinsic relation to God's nature, right? Miserliness could stand in that extrinsic relation too. And I'm really just sort of pointing to a slightly different part of the same problem here, which is just that, like, what we're inclined to say is that there's something about charity itself, an intrinsic property about charity, which is why it's good, right? There's something about charity which makes it good. It's not just any old random thing will do, right? Charity is independently good because of something about charity, because of one of its intrinsic properties. And it seems to me that that's much more plausible than just saying any property that stands in an extrinsic relation to God's nature is good. And so I think we're sucking the intelligibility out of the ascription of goodness by stopping it being about an intrinsic property of the characteristic and making about extrinsic relation to who has that property. And we wouldn't say, why is it that being in the external relation to God is the thing that determines whether or not charity is good? If James is charitable, we don't say that it's in virtue of the fact that James is charitable, right? And if Dylan is charitable, that doesn't seem to make the difference either, right? Even if it's me, right? I don't think that just the properties that I possess, that standing in the relation of being possessed by me, is the thing that makes goodness, that makes charity good. Right? I don't think that I play any particular role. In fact, it doesn't really seem like there's any reason that you could come up with why anything could play that role, right? Not my table, not my chair, not you, me, not everyone in the whole world. It doesn't matter, because it's not that type of fact. We're not looking for somebody to play that role. What we're looking for is the qualities that the characteristic itself has, right? There's something about charity, which is why it's good, because it's helping people, because it's, I don't know, maybe because it's reducing unnecessary suffering or something like that. That's the whole point of charity, right? It's not about who does it. It's about what charity is that makes it good. And by trying to say that the only thing that makes it good is the fact that it's possessed by this person, it completely misses the point about what's good about charity, right? It's not good just because somebody happens to possess it. And it seems to me it doesn't really help the case here to say, oh yeah, but this person made the universe. Well, so what? I mean, that doesn't mean that's still not what's good about charity, right? That it's a characteristic that's possessed by the creator of the universe, right? It's good because it helps people, because it is helping people, right? That's why it's good. It's not good because it's possessed by, and stressing other qualities like he's all powerful, or he controls who goes to the afterlife or something. None of those things seem like they're relevant to making God the thing in virtue of which the possession of that character trait means that character trait is good, right? There can't be anything that fills in those blanks. So I think there's very, very strong reasons to reject this Craig Alston view of divine characteristics here.
Yeah, so like with the whole goodness being rooted in a person, I don't think anyone, or at least to me it seems, you wouldn't just think, well, okay, charity is good, but it must be good because it's the characteristic some. But then the divine command theorist will say, well, it's not just any person, it's this all-powerful, omnipotent, omniscient, all-loving person. It's, you know, so there's something categorically different, they'd say.
Yeah.
But it's still being rooted in a person. And you mentioned something about like the God of the Old Testament having these characteristics of jealousy or whatever. And I think most people would say, well, there's a contextualized way of understanding this. Represent the concern that in some sense there's jealousy in which we don't think is okay. But if it's the case that God is just merely the standard of whether or not jealousy is good or not, then you wouldn't even really ask these questions unless you had the intuition that, well, of morality apart from God. And that's what we're basing our judgment of whether God's jealousy is morally justified or not, or something like that. There's one other argument I was reading in Eric Wielenberg's book called Value and Virtue, and he's addressing Craig's divine command theory, and he gives this argument that goes something like this. It's so suppose that God giving a command is the reason why something is good or bad. Well, you can have two types of naturalists who believe in metaphysical naturalism, one that is unreasonable and one that is reasonable. The unreasonable one, say, has been presented with sufficient evidence to believe that God exists, and they still reject that God exists. The reasonable naturalist is the one who just hasn't been presented with sufficient evidence to believe that God exists. So he's rational in his belief in metaphysical naturalism. And so he doesn't believe that God has given him any divine commands rationally. So if he hasn't been given any divine commands, then it seems the divine command theorist would have to say, well, he has no moral obligation. But of course, they wouldn't want to say that. They'd want to say everybody has moral obligation because of these divine commands. Say something like, well, he probably has moral impulses or something. God gives him moral impulses. But that's not really something that can be considered a command that has an obvious source and origin with God, that God is the origin of this impulse. So he doesn't really have these moral obligations. Theory is true. And if you want to say, well, he does have moral obligations, then there must be moral obligations outside of divine commands, independent of God, that this naturalist has. So what the conclusion of the argument is that, well, even if God does impose some moral obligations on us by virtue of his commands, these can't be all the moral obligations, otherwise rational would be without any moral obligation. So that's the kind of idea he argues for. And I think his point there is to say, well, then the theist have to have these moral obligations that aren't grounded in God in any sense.
So I must have missed a step there somewhere, because so let's say the naturalist has never heard about the God of the Bible or something, and is unaware of, I don't know, some tribesman in the deepest, darkest jungle somewhere has never heard of organized religion at all. In what's going on there is that he doesn't know about any moral obligations that he's under, assuming the divine command theory or something, right? It doesn't seem to me that it follows that he isn't in fact under those commands, right? I'm not only under the obligations that I know about, right? Unless there's a step here, which is that unless you know about it, you're not under an obligation to do something.
Well, so I think the idea is that God has to command a certain individual to do something in order for that obligation to obtain. So the person has to be aware that God requires this obligation, them to do this action or refrain from this action. in order for them to actually have an obligation about it.
No, I do. So that's why I don't understand. So let's just say God commands to Moses that everyone is such that they shouldn't kill. I know he's only really giving his message to the Jewish people or whatever, but let's just say he was giving a universal commandment at that point. But then there's some dude over on the other side of the planet who hasn't heard this. God is still covering him in that universal command, right? He doesn't give each of us our own individual set of commands. He gives blanket commands that apply to everybody, right? Universal kind of categorical principles. Thou shalt not kill. He's not saying, James shall not kill. He's saying nobody should kill. So I don't understand why James somehow not being aware of this universal proclamation means that he's not in fact covered by it. Isn't he covered by it in virtue of the fact that it's a universal commandment?
Yeah. So I think Wielenberg's idea is, even if God does make these universal commandments, in order for them to obtain, the person who is underneath needs to be aware of it. And this isn't really something he seems to argue for in his book. So it's kind of just something that's swept under the rug in the book itself. But I guess that's one way. Yeah, that's one way one could respond to it, to Wielenberg's argument.
Even if you just think about legal cases, right? Ignorance doesn't get you off the hook. I mean, it can diminish somehow the responsibility that you've got if you don't know a specific law, right? But if you're caught speeding, it's not a defense for you to just say, well, I just happened not to look at my speedometer, so I had no idea how fast I was going, right? That doesn't matter, right? The fact that you don't know that you're breaking an obligation doesn't mean that you're not still bound by the obligation. So I don't see why the ignorance in this case really would make any difference. So yeah, I haven't read Wellenberg's book, but it doesn't strike me as particularly plausible at that stage. I mean, it seems to me that the only coherent way of looking at this is that there are certain things that are right or wrong, independently of what anybody thinks about it, right? Independently of what anyone recognizes. So this makes sense out of the idea that there's moral progress, for instance, we were talking about before. Makes easy sense out of the idea that you can condemn other people for doing things. So maybe the Nazis who were participating in the Holocaust genuinely were completely indoctrinated from birth, and that they had no idea that what they were doing was wrong. They brought up in such a weird environment that they don't understand that what they're doing is wrong. Maybe they think that it's right, but I think that it was in fact still wrong anyway. Right? That they were just sort of tragically brainwashed and misled, right? But they were in fact wrong about the fact that what they were doing was not wrong. It was wrong. They were mistaken and incorrect about it. Right? So that seems to me the most straightforward way of viewing what's going on there, and that only really makes sense on a realist view.
So I'm just looking in Wielenberg's book just to see if he said anything more of substance, and I found a part here where he's addressing the question of why know of these moral obligations given to them by God for them to actually have an obligation. And he gives an example here of, so suppose someone hands you an anonymous note and it says, loan Dave your car. And he says, your friend has given you a sign that he intentionally caused, and in doing so intends to issue to you the command to loan him your car. Really capable of understanding the note is conveying the command that to you to loan Dave your car. Are you now morally obligated to loan Dave your car? The answer clearly enough is no, and it's not hard to see why. You have no idea who issued the command. So his idea is that, well, suppose you get a command and you don't know who it's from, it seems that you're obviously obligated to fulfill the command unless you know who it is from. So I guess if you say, well, God commanded Moses that everyone should not kill, and then Moses tells everyone, God told me everyone should not kill, to that person that command actually came from God and Moses isn't just making it up, then I guess, according to Wielenberg's example, it wouldn't be the case that they're actually morally obligated.
Hmm. So the instruction on the note is a command that says, lend Davy your car.
Yeah, and it turns out Dave is your friend who's trying to get you to loan him a car, but the note is anonymous.
But it seems to me that finding out that Dave wrote the note doesn't mean that I find out I'm under an obligation to lend him the car either. I mean, I'm not morally obliged to lend Dave my car just because he writes down on a piece of paper that I should. I don't understand the example. I mean, if that was the case, I would just start handing notes to people telling them that they should lend me money, right? And all the good people would just lend me money, right? And because I would have created an obligation by simply writing it down on a piece of paper and then identifying myself as the author of the instruction. That doesn't seem right.
Right. So I don't think that he's trying to necessarily show that merely issuing a command will obtain a moral obligation, but he's trying to show that issuing a command where there's no, the source of the command indicates that there's no obligation. But I guess that would only work is if, in fact, if there is a command where the source of the command is known, then there's obligation. But as you said, passing out notes, requesting people to give you money, obligation of any sort.
Yeah, so for me, a moral obligation is independent of anyone's issuing of it, right?
Right.
So it doesn't matter if God tells you to kill. That doesn't make it good to kill. It doesn't matter if the king of the land tells you to kill. It doesn't make it good either. It doesn't matter if your father tells you to kill, or your mother, or your best friend, or if I tell you to kill, right? Nobody's instruction to kill, nobody's command for you to kill makes it the case that it's okay to kill. Right? It's just not the sort of thing that's made true by someone's issuing of a command. Someone could command it, and it might happen that what they command coincides with what's good. Right? Like if I say, I command you to give to charity. Now, I haven't placed you under any obligation that you weren't under before. If you're under any obligation at all, it was just good to give to charity or something. I don't make it good to give to charity by saying that. To me, it doesn't even make sense. It's unintelligible that the issuing of a command generates a moral obligation like that. Now, of course, you can have legal contexts, which are completely different, right? If a judge says, I hereby pronounce you guilty, then you actually are guilty. But that's because guilty is a legal term, right? It's not a moral term, right? And it seems to me that the conference of moral properties on things, the issuing of moral commands, is not something. It doesn't make sense for somebody to do it. Right? Like, or the best you can do is say a command that coincides with what's objectively good or bad. That's it. So it's not just the case that I don't know who does it in this case, right? And that's what stops it being a morally relevant thing to do. It's just that that type of thing could never be the thing in virtue of which it was right or wrong for me to do a certain action.
Right. And this all comes from, well, not maybe all comes from, but at least in part comes from the intuition that there are things that are really good in and of themselves, and they're not good by virtue of something else.
Yeah. That's
so
right.
You kind of talked a bit about divine command theory. Could you just explain what your view is? I know you're talking about a bit about pleasure or having the property of goodness and pain having the pleasure of badness. Are you thinking along like utilitarian lines or something, or is your view a bit different?
Yeah, let me just pause for 1 second. I just want to give my dog some food because she's bothering me for it. You know how dogs are. Okay. So just give me 1 second. I'll be right back. Okay, so you're asking me what my view was then?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like I said, I changed my mind on this sort of thing quite a lot, but I feel like what's so I already explained that I feel like some kind of non-naturalist view at this point seems like the way forwards, because it seems to me that any type of naturalist view ends up either turning if I want to say something like the good is a promotion of pleasure or something, right? And I take that to be a matter of definition, then what happens is you've got these funny, weird things that go on here. It's got well-documented sort of things, right? So saying the good is the maximization of pleasure or something like that, well-being, human flourishing or something along those lines, right? Is different from saying, so if I say good is the maximization of well-being or something, and then I say the good is the good, right? Well, if one's a definition, right? Like if I say a bachelor is an unmarried man and a bachelor is a bachelor, really they're both as trivial as each other, right? Neither of them really conveys very much at all, right? They're both matters of definition. But saying the good is the good and saying the good is the maximization of pleasure don't seem to be like that, right? One of them seems to be making a much more substantial claim than the other one, right? So one's trivial and the other one isn't. But in the bachelor case, they're kind of both trivial. It just doesn't look right as a kind of statement of just a definition. But then if we say it's a synthetic truth where, you know, the good happens to coincide with the maximization of pleasure, then, like I said before, the problem with that is that what are we left saying coincides, right? We have two sides of the equation. We need to say they both coincide, but what is one? You know, one side is pleasure, maximization of pleasure. That seems to be fairly well defined. It's a natural property. Well, what's the other thing that we're saying coincides with that? The good. Well, we were trying to explain what that was in the first place. That's why we're giving this explanation, right? But so it doesn't even provide an explanation if it's a synthetic claim. So it's either it's supposed to be construed as a definition that doesn't make sense, or it's supposed to be construed as a synthetic claim, and then it fails to provide any explanation at all. So the non-naturalist really just takes the fact that it doesn't provide any explanation at face value, right? Saying, look, the good just isn't a thing which is understood as being something else, right? It's not reducible to anything like the reduction of harm or the promotion of pleasure, right? It's not supposed to be understood as that, but perhaps it does just coincide with that, right? So it seems to me that good being coincidental with pleasure is a kind of plausible empirical claim, right? It feels to me like a pretty good intuition or something. It's not particularly rock solid, right? But I have an intuition that pleasure is good, and that seems to be about as clear an intuition as I have about anything. And I think when I'm saying that, I'm ascribing pleasure and the things which produce pleasure, or I don't know, well-being or something more nuanced than that, as having a non-natural property that's not reducible to anything else, right? The good property that I'm ascribing to them isn't the same thing as a maximization of pleasure. It just seems to me that the two things are coincidental. Right? I always find one with the other. So it's a bit like utilitarians. I guess you could say something like a non-naturalist utilitarianism or something, if that makes sense. But I change my mind about this sort of thing quite a lot. So you might find in a few weeks I say something different when you ask me what my view is.
Yeah, so with the idea, like, say that pleasure possesses this property of goodness, I guess if someone thought of some where there was a case of pleasure, but you wouldn't think that that is actually a case of goodness, then you could say, what could you say? You could say something like pleasure is normatively good unless we have some reason to think that this case of pleasure isn't. You have to reject that pleasure altogether is a case of having the property of goodness.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So say I come up with some type of counterexample and I say, okay, so you say property of goodness. And then I come up with this counterexample and it shows, well, this person has pleasure, but obviously this thing isn't good. Let's say like somebody takes pleasure in torturing babies or whatever. So it gives the person pleasure, but it also causes pain, and so that pleasure wrong with it, and so that pleasure isn't good. So would you then have to say, well, something like pleasure is good in so far as that it doesn't cause any pain or something like that? Like you'd have to have a nuanced.
No, I mean, that like the pain. The thing is, the situation that you're describing, it has a net negative, right? It has a net pain, right? So the action is bad. Kind of enjoyment out that the person is getting. It's not intrinsically wrong to enjoy something, right? But it just happens that the thing that they're enjoying causes harm or pain or something, and so the pain that it causes outweighs the harm that it does, right? So the bad of the example outweighs the good. So overall, it's bad, right? So that doesn't seem to be a kind of challenge. That's just general utilitarianism way of calculating what's good or bad, right? All I'm adding is that when you say that it's good or bad, you're not taking that as a definition, but you're taking it as a synthetic claim about a non-natural property that's possessed by that situation. So the situation of the person torturing the babies is bad, and the reason it's bad is because the goodness and badness essentially supervene on pain and pleasure, and there's more pain in that situation than pleasure. So overall, bottoms out at being bad rather than good.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I follow. So the like net value of pain over pleasure determines the goodness or badness.
And so let's look at a situation like charity then. So why is charity good? Well, one answer we looked at a minute ago is charity is good in virtue of the fact that it's a characteristic that's possessed by God or something. Well, on my view, charity is good in virtue of something to do with charity, right? So it already passes this hurdle that I said the Alston view fails. And well, what is it about charity that makes it good? Well, the thing is, charity is kind of the redistribution of something from people who have it to people who need it. And so people who need it more benefit more. They get pleasure from the having of the thing that's been passed to them by someone else who doesn't really need it. So they're not really losing much in terms of pleasure that they're getting from this thing, whatever it is they donate. I don't know, a pair of trousers to a charity shop or something, and then someone who needs a pair of trousers but can't afford it buys it from the charity shop because it's really cheap, and they get a lot of pleasure out of this new pair of trousers. The person who gave it to the charity shop probably wasn't going to wear those trousers again, so hasn't lost anything, right? So there's a net gain out of that situation. That's what's good about charity. It gives a convincing explanation about it, satisfying. It says there's something about charity, which is what makes it. Charity is good in virtue of the fact that it, on balance, improves pleasure over pain, right? It improves our lot in society rather than diminishes it. That's what's good about charity. It's not that it's possessed by some character who, for some mysterious reason, is the thing in virtue of which charity is good, right? It's good because of what it's like, right? That's why it's good. So I find those views we were talking about before, that Alston view, sucks away this very, very intuitive explanation of what is good about a character trait or action in virtue of which it's good, right? So that's what I find kind of compelling about a view of this nature, is that it gives you kind of explanatory, and it kind of gives you an explanation of what we mean when we say that certain properties are good and certain properties are bad, including character traits, which the other view just leaves unintelligible.
Right. So on your view, you can say that if someone does something that's good, they can do it with the motivation that the thing is good in itself. Whereas on Alston's view, you can't really say that, because nothing is really good in itself except maybe God, because he's the definition of good. But like no action, charity, or truth or whatever, on Alston's view, is good intrinsically. It's all extrinsic. Whereas on your view, you can still say that things are actually good in themselves.
Yes, exactly, right. There's something about charity itself which is the thing in virtue of which it's good, right? And that thing is that it like once you understand what charity is, you can see that it's at least an intent, the intent of charity, because it can go wrong. Of course, I could give someone trousers, they could be allergic to it and die, or so obviously bad stuff can happen with charity. But the point is, the intention of charity is to be good, right? It's supposed to be good when it works properly, when it really is charity. That's the redistribution of things towards the maximization of pain, of pleasure, and pleasure in itself is good, right? That seems to be the intuition. That very easy to understand. I mean, everyone likes pleasure. You've never met anyone who doesn't like pleasure. You might find people who find pleasure in different things, right? Some people like to be whipped or whatever, right? You say, oh, they like pain. Not really. It's just for them, that's pleasurable, right? They still like pleasure. Everybody does. Even masochists like pleasure. They just get pleasure from things that you would find painful. So it seems to me that it's very straightforward to defend this sort of first move, the opening move. I'd find it very strange if someone was to disagree with that. And then I feel like it gets the better of these otherwise difficult cases for the kind of different some different realist meta-ethical views. And I feel like realism is an intuitive position in the first place. I just don't find those cases where someone says it's all a matter of opinion, it's just my opinion or something. I mean, but then like I just find that, you know, making moral progress unintelligible, being unable to kind of really give a substantive like condemnation of slavery or really anything, right? Those things, like they just obviously leave something out of moral prescriptions about and statements about things being good or bad. So that it's kind of relativism, subjectivism just doesn't really seem to be on the table for me. It seems to be just missing out a large part of the character of moral statements. So when you look at the realist options, obviously, like I said, I'd be naturally inclined towards a naturalist view where possible, but it just seems to me that it's unintelligible when you really push at it, the naturalist view. So some non-naturalist position has to be right. So reconciling intuition that pleasure is good with non-naturalism leads to a kind of utilitarian non-naturalism I'm trying to describe here.
Right. So, like, I know that for a lot of people, at least what I noticed a lot online from a lot of like atheists who were once Christians, once they become an atheist, they kind of just this moral relativist view. And I don't know if it's like just a reaction to Christianity having a strong moral realist view or what it is.
Yeah.
That the natural response should be just to say, okay, well, moral realism is correct. Maybe we'll modify some of our, but we can still hold moral realism despite a rejection of theism or whatever. I'm not sure why there's this tendency to just go to straight to moral relativism.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but it's definitely a tendency. It's not just a tendency of people who are leaving Christianity, although it is a tendency, it seems to me, with those people too, but it's also a tendency, I reckon, with people who encounter philosophy for the first time, you know, teaching undergraduates basic introductions to ethics classes. Moral realism is a very unattractive, but it's a thing about like, it's not cool. The moral realism isn't cool. It's like the morality of the parent or something, right? You know, there are these things that are right and wrong, and you shouldn't, you know, violate these principles or whatever. It's not very cool. It's not very rebellious. And I think maybe there's a shared feeling of rebellion amongst the, you know, kind of teenager, early 20s person and the person who's recently sort of rejected the religion of their parents or something. They're both feeling rebellious and trying out new things or whatever. And subjectivism seems to have this tantalizing sort of freedom in there or something like that. I don't know. I'm just sort of speculating on what people's psychological motivations are. But yeah, I think that's right. And I think there's also a kind of group think as well. Like people adopt atheism, or at least people kind of feel like rejecting their religion, start sort of sniffing around for atheism and find prominent figures who share similar views about things, and there's a kind of collective. It's like swapping one outlook or worldview for another one, right? It's not the careful interrogation of each piece of the worldview, keep or reject it on its own merits, but it's like the swapping of one big way of looking at it for another big way of looking at things. And the kind of, so adopting this cliched atheist way of looking at things means, among other things, rejecting moral realism and adopting a kind of subjectivist theory or naturalist. Well, maybe adopting, rejecting, I guess, what is confusingly supernaturalist theory of morality, which to me is just another type of naturalism, right? Because non-naturalism means that morality is kind of a sui generis, irreducible property. So rejecting that God is commanding it and he's the source of morality, and accepting that like the world has natural properties and that's what good and bad is. It's just swapping one type of naturalism for another. So sometimes they do that, and then sometimes they reject realism altogether and adopt a kind of subjectivism or relativism or something. But they also do a similar thing in metaphysics as well. So it's like adoption of, all that exists is material stuff. All that exists is what science can interact with. And it's kind of epistemology that goes with, like, you can't know anything outside of what can be tested and proven empirically. So these kind of views all come together as a kind of generic, let's call it internet atheist. So he's a moral anti-realist, he's a metaphysical naturalist, and his epistemology is empiricism, right? We've all heard, if you haven't bumped into anyone like this, you have probably heard apologists describing people like this, right? Because they're saying, often you hear apologists' arguments aimed at refuting that person's views. So rejecting atheism means rejecting metaphysical naturalism and moral subjectivism and just simple version of empiricism or something, right? So I think that there's a big bundle of needless kind of collective philosophical outlooks that come under the heading of atheism that need to be there. So, I mean, for me, I don't find subjectivism particularly plausible. My moral realism, non-naturalist realism, means that I'm willing to accept that there are things that exist which can't be interacted with by science, and the way of coming to determine that is through some process that's kind of broadly not empirical. It's kind of rational reflection upon the nature of the metaethical claim, the naturalist claim, right? That it doesn't really seem intelligible when you try and think about it. Pushes you, if you want to be a realist, into the non-naturalist camp. So it seems to me I'm willing to accept that there could be things for which there couldn't be scientific evidence. So I guess in that sense I'm not like very typical with this generic atheist perspective. So I see Dylan's left. Are you still there though, James?
Yeah, I'm still here. So you'd say something along the lines that like moral values are some type of abstract property of the universe or of reality, similar to like mathematical properties and the like?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, one of the kind of key moves here with this non-naturalism is not to really say what the properties are. I mean, like one key kind of ingredient is that it's a thing of its own type, right? It's a sui generis category. So it's a bit like an abstract object in a way, but like it's a property. It's a type of property. Right? Properties in general could be thought of as abstract objects. Goodness is a type of property. So in that sense, it's a type of abstract object, but it's not. It's of a type of its own. Basically, it's not the same as being the type of property. Like being a number is a type of property, or being a moral value isn't the same, or being good isn't the same as being 7. It's not really of the same type, right? It's a property.
Mhm.
It's a completely different type of property to that property. And like, as I said, it's a property all of its own. It doesn't make sense to identify it with another property, another type of property.
Right. Yeah. So, but insofar as it is an abstract property in the same way that mathematical properties are, not that it's the type of property that math is, but it's
Yeah.
so like for example, like when we say like so it's like something objective, in the same way that like when we say humans are Homo sapiens, humans isn't like an actual like humans in general is not like something that exists, but rather it's an abstract concept, but it's a real concept. So would that be something along the lines of what you mean?
It has that property of being true, independently of what anybody thinks about it. It has the property of being kind of made true by something that exists in the world. So in that sense, it's similar to those types of things, right? But I'm not sure how much more I can say about it.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, in those respects, yes, it's similar to that. Right? It's a realist position.
Right.
But it's. I'm not necessarily saying that there's an abstract object which is called the good, and it's just to other abstract objects. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be a Platonic theory as such, but it's a realist theory at this stage. Unless someone can point out to me why it has to be a Platonic theory or it couldn't be a Platonic theory, I think I'm at this point not really committing to anything in particular. I think that it's just a property of its own type. And like I said, the reason for going there is if you say something like, if you identify it with a particular thing of any type, then you seem to be able to run the same problems again, right? Like, but is the good, blah, 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 whatever it is that you just tried to identify it with. And it seems like that's always going to be an intelligible question. And if that's right, then what that does is it kind of shows you that the good shouldn't be identified with anything at all. It's its own type of thing. So to the extent that you find that plausible, you really should refrain from identifying it with anything else. It's just its own type of thing. Right? It could just be that that's what things are like, right? And yeah, I mean, like this problem of like trying. If you say, I identify all the facts of thing X, like all the facts about God and what he commands and what his character traits are like and how powerful he is and blah, blah, blah. If you stack all of those things up, it only equals that whatever it is good if you add it in as one of these premises explicitly to begin with, right? Even though God is powerful and even though he really wants you to not kill, it's only right not to kill if it's also the case that what God wants is right. Right? And until you add that extra property in, it really doesn't matter how much you tell me about God. That's never going to equal that it's right not to kill, unless what God wants is right. You have to add that in. And I think that that's going to be true, whatever descriptive thing it is you pick. So these insights make me think that we really shouldn't try associating too strongly what's good with any one particular thing like that. And my identification of the good with pleasure is really only because I have this kind of intuition, right? Which that I completely concede is not a very good way of approaching things. But don't you also think that that pleasure is good, right? Don't you think that? Seems to me that everybody does. And just as you might want to say, well, look, I won't believe in anything on intuition. I need solid evidence for everything that I'm going to believe in. There's other things that you need to reflect on, right? Like the validity of an argument form like modus ponens, right? Modus ponens says if P then Q, first premise, second premise P, then the conclusion is Q, right? If P then Q, P, therefore Q, right? If you don't think that that's valid, if you don't see intuitively that that's valid, there's nothing I can say that will prove that to you, right? There's this Lewis Carroll, I think it's Lewis Carroll, like paper called The Riddle of Achilles and the Tortoise or something. But anyway, it's kind of just demonstrating that somebody could always just say, yeah, but like, why is that valid? And like, and if you can add in, well, look, inferences like that are valid, right? So if this is an inference like that, then that's valid. Then they can also ask, but why is that inference valid? And you're just like locked into this never-ending sequence of like, someone could always just say, I don't find that intuitively valid, so why should I? So there's no real way of grounding the validity of that. At some point, you have to just say, I intuit that that's valid. I feel that it's valid. And it's the same sort of thing that's going on here with morality. If you want any kind of epistemological access, if you ever want to be able to like connect to this non-natural moral property, it's not going to come through you making a measurement. It's going to come through some intuitive feeling like you have with the intuitive validity of modus ponens. Or, you know, your intuition that like, it can't be that P and not P, right? For any P, right? Doesn't matter what that proposition is. You just can't be that both of them. But try and prove that, right? You can't like find a way of making something more fundamental that shows that that's the case, right? Without presupposing that contradiction is true in the first place. At least you might think that, right? So taking one of these kind of lines, you have a tall story to tell. If you know, really difficult time in philosophy, if you want to say that you're not going to believe in anything that's not like completely rigorously backed up by evidence and construe evidence in some kind of empirical sense, like something that's that I can investigate with my senses, right? You won't be able to use basic inferences. You know, there's loads of stuff like this that we need to have some kind of access to, and so all I'm really arguing for at this point is just saying something like very modest use of intuition, just not to guide me through each and every moral case, right? I'm going to wander off into the hard cases and rely on my intuition to tell me what's going on, only modestly using a bit of intuition at the beginning to say, seems like what's pleasurable coincides with what's good. So yeah, I mean, at this stage, this is the way I think about it.
Right. And like you said, that could change tomorrow or whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm inclined to agree with the with respects to atheistic model. I don't really affirm one either. I think of like I had this concept that was it almost seemed as an anti-realist approach, which was something along the lines of perhaps thinking about good. Well, let me try a better way to phrase it. So I had a thought that it was something along the lines of perhaps we can think of goodness in the similar fashion if you suppose that there's this maximally great waterfall, and this maximally great waterfall is the paradigm from which all water flows. So all the water in the earth comes from this maximally great waterfall. This just is the paradigm. And you know, you could insert the water cycle in that if you'd like, but insofar as the source of water, it comes from this maximally great waterfall. It's just what it is. It is waterness in itself. So why can't we think of so when we say things like water, right, or someone that lives in this world says there's water there, or there's salt water there, or something like that, all they're doing is using the term water as a means to describe what the source of it is, right? Or they're measuring it, or when they speak of liquid, you know, this liquid has this much amount of water. It relates to the source in this fashion. So with respects to God, why can't we think of God as simply the paradigm from which goodness flows? And when we use terms as good, it's not when we use terms as good, what we're really saying is this is how this relates to the source. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, it's a metaphor, right? So it's or it's an analogy. So to some extent, I think I see where you're coming from. But I mean, let me ask you this, right? What happens in how does your metaphor handle with the idea that maybe at some point there's a bit of oil that spills over the edge of the waterfall and comes down and pollutes a bit of the water, right? Do you say that the oil is water because it comes from the waterfall too? Or do you say that despite the fact that the oil came from the waterfall, it's oil and not water, right? So it seems like we're in a kind of Euthyphro dilemma again, right? Is the oil water simply in virtue of where it came from, or is the oil water independently of where it came from, right? I think that you're trying to advocate for this view that the oil is water because of where it came from, right? So the command is good because of who commanded it, right? And that seems to me we're just stuck it back exactly where we were a minute ago, saying something like, well, if God had commanded different things, or if he'd had different character traits, then those would be good instead. And anyway, what we're saying is that something is good or bad, not in virtue of any properties in particular that that thing has, but simply in virtue of this extrinsic fact about where it came from. And that just seems to misunderstand, or at least it gives a very implausible reading. So when we look at charity again, let's remember we were saying before that charity is good merely in virtue of the fact that it's one of God's properties. It seems like it doesn't explain anything about charity, doesn't need anything about charity to be that. Anything could play that role. So compare that to my position a minute ago where I was saying, look, the reason charity is good is because it's like, the whole point of charity is it's about redistributing things around so that like people who need them can get them, and that like results in a net pleasure, right, which is good. I'm giving an explanation of what's going on there, which points to a feature of charity itself, an intrinsic property about charity. Whereas on your view, which is the source emanation, it comes from this place and that's what makes it good, then anything which comes from that place is good. And that divorces the link between the property of the thing and its goodness, and just replaces it with saying it's not about what that thing is like, it's just about where it came from, right? And that to me just misunderstands what we're doing when we say that charity is good, or that helping people is nice and punching someone is bad. It's not because it comes because some other guy does charitable things and that's why helping is good. Helping is good because it makes people feel better, right? And that's why it's good. So I feel like that's why I don't like that analogy. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I completely understand. I think that was an excellent point you raised. And again, I don't even really affirm this. It's just like, just a thought I've been having. But to respond to that, so going back to like the metaphor, so when, let's say if you live in this world and you find liquid or you find water, and you get it and you hold it in your hands and you're saying, oh, this is what's coming from that maximally great waterfall. And suppose it was tainted with oil someday, and they were to get it and they saw it with oil, then they just say, oh, look, it's what's coming from that waterfall. Maybe the name wouldn't have to be in play and they'd have to change the name. But it's not really that they are, when they have the thing in their hands, it's not really that they are giving an explanation of it, but rather they're just explaining what it is. So when we look at it in terms of theism, and for example, when you look at someone being sacrificial, right? They sacrifice themselves for someone else, and you look at them, you say, "Oh, that was a good thing." Perhaps, and if so, when you say that was a good thing, given like the metaphor, what you're really saying is you're describing it in relationship to that from which it flows. This is something that a maximally great being would do, or something like that. This coincides with the maximally great being's character. So in as so far as explanations go, you could say something like, because it comes from that maximally great being, it is a maximally great thing to do. And why wouldn't you want to do a maximally great thing?
Okay.
So
Okay. So look,
which is why I said it kind of leads to like an anti-realism. It kind of gets rid of the concept of good, which is kind of not the best thing to do. But just it's just a thought that I've been entertaining.
Okay. Look, if say I said that I'm doing something charitable and that what I'm doing is good, right? And you say to me, well, in virtue of what is your charitable action good, right? Like, why do you think it's good? What makes it good? And I say, well, because it's the sort of thing that Dylan would do, right? Dylan often does like really good things, right? Dylan's like a really cool guy, often does.
Especially with the sunglasses on his Facebook profile now.
Right, yeah, really cool guy.
Yeah.
So like, the reason that it's good is because it's the sort of thing that Dylan would do. Now, it seems to me that even if, and let's just for the sake of it, stipulate that Dylan's perfectly good. He's never done anything bad, and he always does good things. Now, it might be that Dylan's a really good guide, practically speaking, for me, like a good role model or something, right? He's like the person I should emulate, right? Because emulating him means I'll always do good things and never do bad things, because he never does bad things and always does good things, right? So it seems like it's a good practical move for me to mimic him wherever possible. But it doesn't go any measure whatsoever towards being the reason that that thing is good, right? Because so when we ask the same question about Dylan, well, when Dylan does something that's charitable, why is that good, right? And if the answer comes back, well, that's just because that's what Dylan does, then anything that Dylan does would be charitable, right? It stops making sense. It just becomes like a trivial thing, right? I mean, whereas the only way to salvage that being a sensible thing is that Dylan is a saintly character because he objectifies something independent from him, like goodness. He just lives up to these standards. He always does the objectively right thing. It's not just that whatever he does is whatever he does. Obviously, that's going to be true regardless of what he does, right? It's whatever he picks the right thing to do. That's the thing in virtue of which Dylan is good, right? And the reason, if I do what Dylan does, the thing in virtue of which I do good things isn't Dylan's actions. It's the thing that makes Dylan's actions good, right? The objective goodness of those types of actions, right? Both of our actions are made good by the same thing, the objective goodness of those types of things. I might use Dylan as a guide because I think he's a really cool guy and always does the right thing, but that doesn't mean that's actually grounding what makes it good, right? And if you it seems to me, if you substitute Dylan for God, I mean, he's maximally good. Okay, great. Again, we run into exactly the same problem. If that means just that whatever good things are, whatever God does is good, then it sucks away any of the kind of intelligibility from that claim that what God does is good. He stops being a guide for any, like, it stops being like a significant claim that God is the guide to goodness, right? He's not just the kind of character that always happens to display good qualities. He just becomes a person who's like a measuring stick that we use to determine what's good and what's bad, right? And then it sucks. It becomes just an extrinsic fact again. We were back into the same cycle, right? So it seems to me that what's going on with these types of debates is we're just repackaging the same fundamental problem over and over again in different terms. So the Christian meta-ethic, which is, it seems to me, which is like retrofitted, right? That there's this idea of objective goodness and badness, which we want, this is one of the things we're trying to keep in our picture, right? It's for the Christian. We want to have objective good and badness. We don't want it to be just up to the individual. You don't want it to be that there are no truths, right? It's supposed to be this deep moral kind of test. It's the explanation of existence, right? And the Christian view is some kind of moral test of our character. And yet also we need to, it seems to me, shoehorn God into the picture somewhere, right? He needs to be really important, right? He needs to be at the center of everything. So what we do is we try and reconcile these two things by saying that, look, God is good, right? And somehow, some sense or another, God is the same thing as goodness, right? But what we're doing there is the naturalistic fallacy. Again, it's like saying some natural property, like the reduction of pleasure, just as a reduction of pain, just is just what goodness is, right? It's not a non-natural property. It is the reduction of pleasure, right? As soon as you say he just is this thing, it just is God's commands, it just is God's character, it just is the reduction of pain. Once you make that move, then it seems to me you're back in the same situation again, where it's just like now you're either open to this open question objection, where it's like you can say, but is it the case, and blah blah blah, and that means that it feels like it's an intelligible question, right? It shouldn't be if it's just a matter of definition. In the case of the God example, you you're moving the ascription of goodness from being an intrinsic property of the action or character trait and turning it into an extrinsic property of just simply where it came from or who has it. And that ultimately doesn't explain anything, right? So it seems to me that all we're doing with these other things, any of these permutations, anything you pick, it's just going to land you in exactly the same boat every single time. Right? There really isn't any substantive difference between any of these options. So the only move to make, if you want to be a realist, is to reject there really being any thing in virtue of which something is good. It's not good in virtue of the fact that helping people in charity or whatever isn't good in virtue of the fact that it reduces pain, pleasure, or something. It does increase pleasure, and it just happens to be the case that increasing pleasure is good, right? That property isn't true in virtue of anything else, right? So that's the bottom level of the explanation. It's just that's the fact that we have to explain. Now, if we're trying to compare my explanation of things with somebody else's, say the divine command theorist or such, what they have to do is weigh up whether their explanation really does anything more than that. Right? You might say, well, that's just, you've got this bottom level and you're not explaining anything about what it means for something to be good. You're just saying it's good and that can't be explained in any other way. That's true. I'm not really giving an explanation of it any deeper than that, in a sense, right? I'm saying that charity is good because it increases pleasure, and pleasure is good just because pleasure is good, right? There's nothing else to that, right? You have to just intuit that pleasure is coincidental with this moral property of goodness. Now, I don't have anything else to say about that. Like, it just is coincidental with it. Now, you might say, well, that's no explanation, right? I've figured out this bottom ground here, and you don't have anything informative to say there. So, I've caught you. But to my reply is that, well, that's true that, there kind of is a bottom level. But the challenge is, can any other theory do any better? Like, if you have a divine command theory, as we've gone over a couple of times already, it seems to me that not only do you not do better, you actually do substantially worse, right? You either just end up having a view where, well, God's in the picture, but all he's doing is commanding the things that happen to be independently good anyway. So you still end up postulating this kind of bottom level, independently good, but there's nothing else you can say about it level. And you just have God there kind of wagging his finger at things that are independently bad, right? But it kind of doesn't matter that he's there. And that's not a great theory. That's one horn of the Euthyphro dilemma. Though it's coherent, it doesn't really seem to confer any advantage over my theory, right? It's the same theory, just has God in the picture. On the other hand, any other theory that you have with God trying to be really important in there seems to evacuate the concepts that we need, that we're talking about, of everything that makes them significant. Right? Virtues are only good because God has them. They're not good because of anything about those particular virtues. Right? So we seem to be stuck in this, in a position that's far worse. Right? So my defense of this kind of primacy and the fact that you can't really say anything extra about goodness, which I admit isn't particularly satisfying intellectually, is just that there aren't any other moves to make here. Right? We seem to be forced into saying this. So this is a sort of somewhat reluctant non-naturalist position here. It just seems to be the case that it's the best theory available. So I don't know. I think I need to kind of draw this to a close anyway, because I've got a couple of errands I need to do. So is there any other last things you want to bring up?
No, I think that was good. I think that theists should not be so hardcore about divine command theory, and I think it would be wise if we took a more agnostic approach, because it seems to me as if Euthyphro is not dead.
Yeah, I certainly think Euthyphro is not dead. And I think that atheists need to be less hardcore about kind of strong naturalism and a kind of like tendency to materialism and scientism and stuff. And I think that, there is a very fertile middle ground between these two extremes, which are so often represented on the internet.
Right. I appreciate that. And before we close, in the last time you joined us, you said that you'd come back on when we had another argument for theism, and to let you know, and I formulated one.
Oh, good.
Yeah, in case you want to hear it, it's based on modus ponens. It says, if Alex Malpass joins us for a second podcast episode, then God exists. Alex Malpass joined us in this podcast episode. Therefore, God exists. So you can take the next few weeks to think about that one.
Yeah. Although I think I've been immediately converted now, so no.
Yeah. So exactly. No, but in all seriousness, thank you, Alex, once again for joining us. We consider you a friend, and you are always a treat to have with us. Dylan, are you still there? Okay, so unfortunately Dylan lost connection. It's funny because that's actually what happened in our last podcast episode. We were with Tyler and I lost connection. So Alex, if there's any last words that you'd like to say?
No, I think I've said enough words. So yeah, thanks very much. Fun.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you everyone for listening. This is Arguments from Reason. Be sure to check out Alex Malpass podcast and his blog. His podcast is called Thoughtology, and his blog is called Use of Reason. Once again, everyone, thank you and God bless.